Today I've got an awesome guide on how to shoot video with your Fujifilm X-T5 camera. Hi everyone, welcome to Pal to Tech. Although we're focusing on the X-T5 camera, almost all of the video information that I'm going to be teaching you, you can use for other Fujifilm cameras as well. So first thing, you're going to want to switch over your mode dial from still to movie mode. The better the quality of the video that you're shooting, the larger and more demanding the file is that's being saved by the camera to the SD card. Now, I should probably make another entire video on understanding SD cards and what all these goofy little symbols mean that you see on them. For this video, the most important one that you should probably know is the V-Speed class. An SD card that has a V-Speed class of maybe 60 or 90 is definitely going to be able to handle just about any type of video that you shoot on this camera. You could probably get away with a V30, but I would recommend, if your budget allows it, going with at least a V60, because you never know what type of future camera you're going to have or what type of video quality you're going to end up shooting and so forth. That will really help kind of prevent problems further on down line. And once your camera's on, you go into your movie settings. Now what? The first few options you see right here are really confusing, so let's sort them out. At the very top of your movie mode settings are probably the two most confusing but most important ones of all: movie setting list and movie mode. The most important thing I want you to remember about this is that the items that you see right here in movie mode, this column and this column, are also inside movie setting list. You see it right here, and if you press menu OK when it's highlighted, it takes you to movie mode. In other words, you can get to movie mode from either movie mode or from the top of this area in movie setting list. Think of movie setting list as a collection of shortcuts that jump to other parts of the movie menu. One of the things you want to make sure you have set correctly is your media record setting. Those also appear in movie settings list right here. So now we're going to return to the most important setting, movie mode. When you're shooting video, just like stills, you have to deal with resolution. They are measured in pixels. And you have aspect ratios as well, the same as you do with stills. So on this camera, the highest and best resolution that you can shoot with is 6.2K. And that resolution only offers a 16:9 aspect ratio. Then you have what I consider to be 4 different versions of 4K. First, there's regular 4K. Next is a special 4K version. It's called 4K HQ. And what's going on here with that one is your Fujifilm camera is actually shooting in 6.2K, and then it is sort of downsampling that to 4K. In theory, at least, the quality of 4K HQ will be slightly better. So the third type of 4K is 4K DCI. And DCI is only available in that 17:9 format, which is optimized for the aspect ratio that's most commonly used in motion pictures. And the fourth and last version of 4K is 4K DCI HQ. And just like the other 4K HQ choice, the 4K DCI HQ is shooting in 6.2K and then downsampling that higher quality footage into 4K. And finally, you have these last two resolutions right here: high definition, or otherwise known as 1080p, or in the menu, otherwise known as FHD. And you have a choice of either 16:9 or 17:9 aspect ratio. So then, which one should you pick? Well, in most cases, when you're shooting video, you're trying to balance video quality, file size, compression, and lots of other options. I recommend that you shoot in 4K 16:9. What's great is that even if you don't need it for your requirements and it's more resolution than you need, you'll be able to crop in, right? And you'll have better quality when you're editing in post-production. Let's move on to the next column right here, which is frame rate. When you're shooting video, regular video, with your Fujifilm camera, these are the choices of frame rates. However, keep in mind there is also a high-speed record option, which will allow you to shoot at much higher frame rates if you want to have slow motion. But to be honest with you, unless you really need that, I wouldn't use it because it has some limitations. The number one being that it is limited to only 1080p or HD resolution, and it doesn't allow you to also have audio. The first thing you should know about about the choices of frame rates here is that they are dependent upon what resolution you have selected, okay? For example, if I choose 6.2K, the highest frame rate I can get is 30 frames a second. You see that right there? The higher frame rates are grayed out because the camera can't support it. However, if I drop down to 4K, I can then go up and choose a higher frame rate. Now, I know I just said 30 frames per second. However, when you look at this right here, it says 29.97. That's not 30. That's almost 30, but it's not 30. However, we call it 30, and that is considered shooting at 30 frames per second. And for extra fun, it's even more confusing if we're shooting in 24 frames per second, because now you have a choice of 24 and 23.98. And then you've got 25 frames per second. What is up with this weirdness? First thing, 25 frames per second is for areas that are outside of North America and Japan that broadcast on television. If you are shooting for that, then you're going to want to put it in 25 frames per second. 24 frames per second is used in motion pictures, okay? So if you're sitting in a movie theater and you're munching on popcorn and you're staring at a screen, you're watching 24 frames per second. But wait, you ask, why is there a 23.98 and a regular 24? What's the difference between the two? 24 frames per second, 2.4, the regular 2.4 value, that has been around since the 1920s, and that is intended for motion pictures. Think film and cinema. However, the option of 23.98 frames per second was added back in the 1950s to enable 24 frames per second to work with television broadcasting, in particular color television. Okay, please pull over while I say the next sentence. I really don't want you falling asleep if you're watching this video and driving, which you shouldn't be. And it was necessary back then to reduce the frame rate just a little bit to prevent the interference between the color subcarrier and the audio signal. So, which frame rate do you choose? And like anything else in life, it all depends. If you have absolutely no idea and you're completely new at this and you want to have as much flexibility as possible with what you're filming, I would say go with 30 frames per second. If you're shooting sports or really fast action, or if you plan on doing post-production editing for sure on your footage, then consider 60 frames per second. And the number one benefit of shooting in 60 frames per second is that later on in post-production, you can slow it down to 24 frames per second and the slow motion will look great. However, if you shot in 24 frames per second and you take it into post-production and you slow it down, it's going to look awful. Okay, so now at this point, we've chosen our resolution and aspect ratio. We're going to go with 4K 16:9. And we've chosen our frame rate of 30 frames per second. What I'm about to tell you in the next section of this video is going to make you sound really smart, sophisticated, and cool when you go to future parties. Codec stands for compression decompression. And the reason that you have to choose and use a codec when you're shooting video is because of the very large file sizes for video. I mean, uncompressed raw video shot at 4K, okay, or 6.2K, without using a codec, it's massive. So lucky for you, your X-T5 and other Fujifilm cameras offer a choice of codecs that the camera will use to crush down that massively large video file size and make it a lot smaller by the time it saves to the SD card. Of course, just like a JPEG, the more compressed you make your footage, the lower the quality of that footage, right? Too much compression, you're going to have a really crappy video. But lucky for us, the codec settings that are offered by the camera are not going to ruin your video. To choose a codec, you want to go into your movie menu, go into the movie setting list, and right here is where you choose your codec. You can also get to it by going down to Media Record Setting. There's 3 columns here. The first is the output setting, where obviously right here, I've told the camera I want to first save the video footage to the SD card in slot 1, and then the one in slot 2. You can reverse it right here, or you can save a duplicate copy of your movie file to the other SD card at the same time. This is also where you would specify HDMI out. And now we get to the actual codec setting choices right here. I'm not going to get into all the technical details of this, but I am going to tell you the important things you need to know for this video. As I mentioned, this column right here is where you would select your codec, and this column is where you select your bitrate. So the first thing is that you will notice that some of these choices are grayed out, and that's because your bitrate is dependent upon the choice of codec as well as your frame rate. So if you see a bitrate that you want to use and it's grayed out, you're probably going to have to go back into here, change something like this, and go back, and there it is. As you scroll through the various codec compression choices, you can actually kind of get an idea of how strong they are. Have a look at this area right here. This shows you the total remaining length of video time that you can shoot and still be able to save it on your current SD card. And as you scroll through these, you can definitely see which codec is stronger than the other one. In other words, which compression choice will compress the most, right? For example, if I choose this compression setting right here, I can shoot 1 hour, 18 minutes, and 24 seconds of video before the SD card is full. However, if I choose this compression choice, I can only shoot 22 minutes and 28 seconds. By the way, if you forget what some of these various settings mean and so forth, just go ahead and press the Q button on the side of the camera, and the camera will display more information about these settings. Down here on the lower right are your color depth and your audio compression quality settings. If you choose a compression choice with 10-bit, that will give your color footage more information than 8-bit. It's kind of, sort of, maybe perhaps like Adobe RGB will give you more color space than sRGB. I think that for 99% of what you're going to be doing, you're not going to need to worry about these. In general, you have two main categories of codecs, H.264 and H.265. H.264 is basically among the most common of the compression types and the most widely supported. But in a number of situations, it can result in larger file sizes. For example, right now with this camera, if I choose H.264 right here, I can shoot for 1 hour, 18 minutes, and 24 seconds. H.265, on the other hand, does offer better compression, and there are definitely times it can give you smaller file sizes. However, it does require more computer processing power to edit. In other words, if you are sitting in front of your computer and you've opened up an H.264 and an H.265 file, right, and you're going to edit them together, the computer is going to have to work harder to edit the H.265 file. But frankly, if you've purchased a computer in, say, the past, 5 to 7 years, it shouldn't be that big of an issue for you. Now, continuing as we look at the name of these various choices, you'll see that you can choose either LongGOP or All-Intra. There's going to be some topics that we're going to have to hold off on for maybe an advanced part 2 video. This is one of them, okay? But to put it simply, these two different flavors of compression, right, LongGOP or All-Intra, have to do with how the codec handles the individual frames of your video when it's doing the actual compression. All-Intra gives you a larger video file, but it's easier on your computer to edit later on. Regarding this one, I'm going to recommend that you just go with LongGOP for now. Next, you've got a 3-digit number. You see that right here. It's either 420 or 422. 422 and 420 are two choices of chroma subsampling ratios that determine how color information is recorded in video. I am going to skip getting into the details of this one completely because I already made a video on this. By the way, if you're shooting videos mostly for social media and things like that, 420 is fine. And the last column right here, you see you have a choice between MOV and MP4. I'll just say very simply that that is the file extension when you get the file off the SD card, and we'll just leave it at that for this video, okay? So as I did with resolution and frame rate, I'm just going to tell you a recommended setting that I think you want to start with that'll serve you very well in a variety of shooting situations. We're going to go with H.264, LongGOP 420, and I would recommend MOV. The reason that we're going with MOV and not MP4 is how this choice changes right here. You see that? With MOV, we get LPCM. LPCM stands for Linear Pulse Code Modulation, while AAC stands for Advanced Audio Coding. And LPCM is going to give you the uncompressed audio, okay, a higher quality than you would get with AAC. Now, obviously, if you're never planning on editing your videos at all whatsoever or touching the audio, audio, then I think either one are fine. I'm going to still recommend that you go with LPCM, and the reason for that is because one day you might, number one, and number two, the file size difference is negligible. So you're going to have a better quality audio and an uncompressed version of it, and you're not really giving up much. You see, look at this right here. The AAC version, I can shoot 1 hour, 18 minutes, and 24 seconds. The LPCM version, I can also shoot 1 hour, 18 minutes, and 24 seconds. And finally, we come to bitrate. Bitrate refers to the amount of data, okay, that is used to represent a single second of your video footage. It's measured in megabits per second. The maximum bitrate that the X-T5 can shoot is 360 megabits per second. Some Fujifilm cameras can offer higher bit rates and some have only lower bit rates. Bitrate is so important. It affects everything in your video. Your color, your clarity, your motion, your shadows, your highlights, and the higher the bitrate you have, the better that your video is going to look. Of course, the larger your file size will be, and the opposite is true. You're looking to choose a trade-off between a bit rate that is a manageable file size, so it's not too high of a bit rate, but doesn't make your footage look crappy like low-value bit rates do. We could go back and forth on what is the best bit rate to use. Let me just save you some time, okay? I'm going to suggest that you choose either 200 or 300 megabits per second. If it's client work, choose 360. Now, if you have a Fujifilm camera and you don't have those number options in there, choose the highest one you have that's below or equal to 360. And yes, you could go down to 100 and it may, depending upon what you're watching it on, say a phone, right? You may not and probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But again, it's kind of like shooting JPEGs, but also shooting RAW with it. Why not have the quality really good? You never know what you're going to do with your video, and you don't get a second chance to reshoot it. I just realized something. This is really awesome because you can now sound really smart and like a total videographer at your next party. You want to know what I used? 4K 16:9 30 frames per second H.264 LongGOP codec with a 422 chroma subsampling and 360 megabits per second bitrate. So at this point, you've got one final but important decision to make before you start shooting. What film simulation will you be using? And just like stills, they're located in the IQ section of your camera menu. For video, remember, you can't just change out your film simulation like you can with RAW files and still photos. You know, with RAW, you can shoot in Acros, say, take the RAW file, put it in Lightroom, open up, Adobe Camera Raw, and then change the film simulation to Velvia, right? You can do that with RAW files. Since the video files are coming off the camera onto the SD card in either MOV or MP4 format, it is not a RAW file, okay? And therefore, the film simulation is baked right into the video file you have. So choose wisely. If you have no idea which one to use and where to start with this, I would say choose either Provia Standard, or you could consider choosing Eterna. This is a very popular film simulation and much loved by a lot of Fujifilm users that shoot in video, and it gives you more flexibility in post-production because it's more of a flat profile and you can really tweak the colors and change things around. Even if you don't, it's just beautiful. Now, if you do end up choosing Eterna, there is one little recommendation that I have because it is more of a flat profile. With that specific film simulation for video, I would go back into my camera menu, still in the IQ section, into dynamic range, and change this to 400%. I recommend that you don't shoot in a black and white film simulation. You know, the ones like Acros, monochrome, because here's the thing. It is much easier to take footage that was shot in color and make it black and white versus if you shot it in black and white, like Acros, and then you want later on to convert it to color. It's just something to think about. And since we're in the IQ section, another thing you might want to do is go down to sharpness, and I would drop it down to -2. And the reason we want to do that, particularly if you're, say, shooting in 24 frames a second and you want that cinematic look, you don't want your footage to be over sharpened or to look like something that was shot on a smartphone, you know, that look to it. Now, as I said in the beginning of this video, there's going to be a number of settings that we are not going to cover today because that would be for an advanced part 2 video. And on that list is F-Log, F-Log2, and HLG. I will tell you that all three of those settings are concerned with dynamic range and giving you more of it. Normally when you're shooting with your film simulation in the mode that we just went through setting up, and you would be choosing this one right here. And the location of this menu and the style looks a little different depending upon what Fujifilm camera you're using, but you basically want to choose the one that has the little icon with the film strip. Regarding exposure and focusing for your video, I recommend going into photometry and either choosing center weighted or multi. Go into AF/MF, and I would make sure that my AF mode is set to area. And this right here is the most important autofocus setting on the camera, and is what I think is a good starting point for you. I would recommend setting tracking sensitivity to 2 and AF speed to 5. If you are shooting people in your video and that's your main subject, you might want to try turning on face eye detection setting and put it at eye auto. One thing that I highly recommend a lot is go into the camera icon and look for movie optimized control. On your particular model of Fujifilm camera, it might say movie silent control or something like that, but it's in the same area. A lot of people happen to love that setting because basically it gives you a touchscreen menu that you can set for video. And then when you're actually shooting and you need to make a setting change, you're just using the touchscreen right on the back of the camera. Technically, it's silent and you're not rotating any of the controls on the top or the aperture, that kind of thing. The second thing I'm going to tell you is I think it's horrible because when it's enabled, there are various settings on the camera that just are disabled. The ability to jump in and use the actual controls to adjust some of your exposure triangle settings. So my advice to you, if you're new at shooting video with Fujifilm cameras, keep it off for now. Learn to use the other controls on the camera. Speaking of which, I am now going to tell you what your correct shutter speed should be. Remember in the menu, we chose our frame rate, okay? Now, right now, I've got it set to 24 frames per second. So you are going to want to set your shutter speed to always be double that. Remember, I had my camera set to 24 frames per second. 24 times 2 is 48. Well, there's no 48 on the shutter speed dial, so put it to just one of the closest numbers. Flip your camera over and rotate the rear command dial. Have a look at this. You're at 40 and then bam, 48. Exactly 48. That's what you want to have it at. If you're shooting 60 frames a second, your shutter speed is 1/120th of a second, and so forth. Okay, so you've got your shutter speed fixed set. You don't change that whatsoever, and it is double your frame rate. As far as aperture is concerned, I would recommend to go ahead and set it to f4. You don't have to keep it there, right? I mean, you can change that depending upon how much depth of field you want to have, your exposure conditions, and so forth. And then we come to ISO, which Fujifilm calls sensitivity. You could also put it in auto ISO and have the camera automatically adjust the exposure for you as well. The next exposure tool that you might want to enable, it's located in the regular camera icon area right here, and it's called Zebra Setting. Go ahead and turn it on. It doesn't matter whether you choose right or left, it's just preference. Now, with regard to zebra level, you might want to set it to 70 or even 65. And the reason for that would be if you are filming people. If you are trying to get good exposure on someone's face, okay, setting it to 70 or 65%. And then when you aim the camera at the person. So now if you see zebra stripes on someone's face, that means their face is overexposed. And you're going to want to fix it by adjusting your camera settings. You can have a little bit on there. It's okay. They're like ants. Now, obviously, when you're out and about shooting video, if your camera is not locked down on a tripod, you should go into your camera's settings and make sure that image stabilization is turned on. Not all cameras support this, but those that do, you should definitely have it turned on. However, getting started, I would not choose digital image stabilization. I don't want to get into the whole weeds with this, but just choose regular IBIS OIS. For IS mode boost, there are more people thrown by this one and they get terrible footage because they don't know how to use it right. So if you go into it, for example, it shows it off. My eye goes, pshh, I see the words down below. Suitable for shooting with panning, tilting, and tracking subjects. IS mode boost is suitable for this thing that it just told me. So you go ahead and you turn it on, right? And your footage is wobbly in the background because you're running around panning and moving the camera. When we were in IS mode boost and we saw this little helpful message, when we move the setting up to on, look at how the message changed. So if you are static, hand holding and standing there like a tripod, but just standing there and not really moving around, turn on IS mode boost. With regard to audio, it is always better to get the microphone as close to your subject as possible. This is not a video on audio, but I'm just going to give you a quick tip right here. In your audio settings, make sure that your internal mic adjustment is not like that. If it's off, you're going to have no sound. I would keep it in auto. Make sure your mic jack setting is set to mic and not line. I would turn on my mic level limiter. That will help prevent clipping, otherwise known as horrible audio distortion you can't fix. I would keep wind filter and low cut filter off. I find that both of those settings don't do that good of a job and can actually make your audio worse. So I would keep it off. However, if you're standing on the shore of Lake Michigan in Chicago and the wind is blowing like a monsoon, then yeah, maybe put the wind to on. Forget time code, don't need to cover that one. Okay, and we're out of the menu. While we certainly covered a lot of topics today, there were a number of things that we didn't discuss. Most notably F-Log, F-Log2, HLG, and raw video output. And then there's a number of video tools that are on some Fujifilm camera models and not others, such as Focus Map, which is on the GFX and so forth. But in the meantime, for those of you who are new to this, knowing what frame rate to use or what motion to go with, all of that will become intuitive to you over time. And it won't take that long. All of this stuff has no other purpose than to serve the story in your video. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found the video helpful or at least entertaining. And if you did, be sure to give it the like and subscribe. I will see you in a new video very soon. Take care.